Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, signore e signori, benvenuti, buongiorno. I'm very happy to welcome you to today's webinar dedicated to a brief history of wireless communication by Daniela Tuninetti. I would like therefore to welcome our key speaker, Professor Tuninetti. She's professor and head of the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and co-director of the UIC Networks Information, Communication, and Engineering System Laboratory, the nicest laboratory, where she conducts research on information and data processing, communication, and storage over network. It's a pleasure as well to meet again wireless, to meet again Dr. Eleonora Forte, research assistant, professor of the Proteomics Center of Excellence in Surgery and Organ Transplantation at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine, and president of the Chicago chapter of AIRIcerca, the Association of Italian Researchers around the world. I'm very particularly pleased to host today's webinar because the topic we are addressing and that Professor Tuninetti will enlighten us about will help us understand a little bit more of our daily life that especially in the last 9 months have become so dependent on wireless communication, so that even Italian cultural institutes host virtual wireless events like the one we are hosting today. And secondly, I'm particularly pleased, the jokes aside, to cooperate again with AIRIcerca and to contribute to the effort of AIRIcerca of disseminating scientific culture. I would like to remind you that you can type your questions using the Q&A button that you can find at the bottom of the screen, and that today's webinar will be recorded and then will be available on our YouTube channel. It might be also live on Facebook, but I just failed logging in, so it might not be live on Facebook. But otherwise, you will be able to watch it again on our YouTube channel. At the end of the webinar, we'll have 10-15 minutes of a Q&A with Professor Tuninetti. And then now it's time to leave the floor to our guests, Dr. Forte and Professor Tuninetti. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Director. Good morning, everybody. I would like to start, of course, thanking the Director of the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago for supporting us in the organization of today's webinar. Welcome to the guests of the Institute, the member of AIRIcerca, and of course, everybody who joined us today and spend 1 hour of their Saturday with us. Just a few words about AIRIcerca. AIRIcerca is an international association of Italian researchers that aims to promote collaboration and interaction between Italian scientists and mainly to communicate science to the general public, who will have the chance to hear the latest scientific developments from experts in the field. Here in Chicago, we founded the first local chapter of the association in 2017, and since then, we, in collaboration with the Italian Cultural Institute of Chicago, we have organized several science outreaching events featuring Italian excellence that works in the Chicago area. Today, I have really the pleasure to introduce Daniela Tuninetti. Like the director mentioned, she is the head of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she co-directed this pretty unique laboratory, and where they study information data and processing. I would like also to add that Dr. Tuninetti holds an MS in electrical engineering from the Politecnico of Turin in Italy, and a PhD always in electrical engineering from Telecom Paris Tech. Today, she will talk about the history of wireless communication. So all of us every day use wireless devices, but we don't know how they work. Let's face the reality. The phones that we carry with us are the result of the research of many scientists over many years of work. So today we are really looking forward to know how they work. And, you can ask the question in the Q&A button at the end of the seminar. Without further ado, Daniela, please take the floor, and thank you again for being with us today. Thank you.
Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning. I've started to share my screen. Please let me know if you see it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, so I made a slide addition to the title of my presentation. I'm gonna talk about the history of cellular communication. There are very many different types of wireless communications. This is what I'm an expert on. So this talk is about cellular communication. I am grateful for AIRIcerca for organizing this event, to the Italian Institute, Istituto Italiano di Cultura for co-hosting this event, but I'm also grateful for all the people that have helped me learn more about this subject over the years. My research endeavor started, almost 30 years ago, and I've met so many mentors and professors and students and colleagues, and I want to thank them all, because this, as Eleonora said, is not the work of one person, it's a work of a whole community. And also thank you for all of you who decided to spend, part of your morning, your Saturday morning with us today. So as was said before, I'm part of the nicest lab at in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at UIC. It's nicest not just because all the founding members of this group are women, but because we are working on networks, on information, on communication and engineering systems. We have expertise from the theory of communication systems. This is what myself and Professor De Breuer are doing, to more practical aspects of wireless communication. This is what Professor Smida does, all the way up to networking, and this is what Professor Seferoglou does. So if you want more information about what we do, just look for the nicest lab at UIC. The wireless communication has a long history. Wireless is any form of communication by which you can communicate something from a source to a destination without a physical media in between, so without a wire. And this has a long history. The need to communicate without a physical mean has been with human race from the very beginning. And smoke signals can be thought as the first type of signals that didn't use a wire. But this is not where I want to start, really, because I want to get to the point in which we are having these fantastic computers that allow us to do all form of communications, not just verbal communication, but also data communications while we are on the move. So when I thought about this talk and the many things that one could talk about, I had, a bit of a headache because I really didn't know where to start. And then I thought that probably the right place to start is when we started to really investigate from, a scientific point of view, the properties of electromagnetic waves. And this started in the 17th century, where people started to notice all this phenomenon and started to figure out how we can mathematically explain them. And the pinnacle of this is the work of Maxwell, who at the end of the 1800s formulated an electromagnetic theory of light. And he has compressed all that is going on in the electromagnetic world with 4 beautiful equations that bear his name. Now, these are the 4 equations. I don't expect you to know what they are. I just think that they are not just powerful in what they express, but even aesthetically beautiful. So this slide is what was used to advertise this talk. And this is what I originally thought of talking about, just the evolution in time of technology. But then I thought that probably this would be, like missing a chance. There is a lot of information about, just basic historical fact that you can find on the internet. And I thought that I'd rather use this occasion to talk about the technological underpinning of those developments. So I really want to talk about technology in a way that hopefully is accessible to also somebody who doesn't have a degree in engineering. So just briefly, if we look at time, as I said, Maxwell developed a theory for electromagnetic waves propagation. And immediately after, Guglielmo Marconi and other people understood the potential of using these new discovered physical phenomena for communication purposes. And right at the end of the 1800s, it proved that it is possible to communicate using electromagnetic waves. He was a great scientist, a great entrepreneur, filed patents and founded company. And in 1901, if I remember correctly, or 09, maybe 09, he received the Nobel Prize for advancing our understanding of telecommunications. Now, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is a big difference. And in order to get to, the theory of electromagnetic wave propagation to the kind of devices that we have today, a lot of things had to happen. And this involves all sorts of engineering sciences, including material science and computers, chip designs and touch screens, batteries, all sorts of things that they need to evolve and come to the point to create such powerful devices that we use today. Now, I'm not talking about all these type of things because it would be too much. I want to just focus on the wireless aspect of this. And in particular, I'd like to point out some key dates. So in 1948, Claude Shannon published a paper, a very fundamental paper about how can we think in a more abstract way about communication systems. And this is really what has laid the foundation of everything digital technology that we use today. So this was right after the war. At the same time, we started to see, the first radio, the first color TV devices that have been available commercially. But when we look at really cellular system, it was only in 1973 that the first public phone call was made on what we now call a cell phone, which is now went down in the history with the name of the brick phone. A few years later, in 1978, Bell launched the first cellular network, commercial cellular network, right here in Chicago. And it was a success, but it was very limited in terms of capability. And indeed, within a few months of deployment, it was already saturated in terms of capacity. So it became clear that there is a great potential with this type of technology, but was available at the end of the 70s was really inadequate. So at the beginning of the 80s, a bunch of European countries came together to form an alliance to develop the next generation of wireless system, one that would be more scalable and would overcome some of the limitations that were present in what we now call the first generation of wireless systems. So this happened at the beginning of the 80s. And there is a lot of work that needs to go into looking into devices and technologies and algorithms and protocols and so on and so forth before you can have an actual technology that can be deployed. And indeed, 10 years had to pass before we actually had the first commercial 2G network, the one that in Europe and in most part of the world goes under the name of GSM. So a decade just to figure out how to overcome all the limitations of 1G and deploy commercially the second generation of wireless network. Now, these networks were mainly concerned about communicating voice, but at the same time, a number of other things were happening in the world of internet. And it was, again, 2G, GSM was a success, was the first really international network that would allow roaming and a number of other functionalities. But it became immediately clear that people didn't want to do just voice. They also wanted to do data. And so while GSM was being deployed, research work started to figure out how to incorporate data on a mobile wireless network. And so there is a decade of work to arrive to the so-called 3G systems, which was deployed at the beginning of the century. So 3G is really a network that is designed for data for mobile users, even users that are on fast-moving objects like trains, okay? So 3G was really, if you remember, for those who were around at that time, was super hyped. and it fell short really of those big promises. And in fact, it had a bit of a low start, and it became apparent that there were a bunch of limitations that need to be overcome before, having a truly broadband, this is how we call it today, a broadband wireless network, something that would allow you to do, like streaming of videos and these kind of applications. So again, at the beginning of the 2000s, a new decade of work starts to really develop a broadband wireless network. And in about, it was about 2010, in which we had the 4G LTE network. That is what we are using today. Now, this network works really well. I hope you agree with me. It allows, an array of applications and a pretty seamless, internet experience. It doesn't really matter whether you are on a mobile device or on a computer. You get an excellent, user experience. And yet, despite this, we realized that there are so many other applications which would benefit from the use of wireless that we are now, at that point, so about 10 years ago, we started to think about how to even further improve this, this network. So now we are in 2020, and there is, we are seeing the deployment of a 5G network. I'm going to touch upon 5G network. Which will allow a much higher connectivity and a much higher bit rate. So as you can see, about every decade, we have a new generation of wireless systems. And what I want to spend the next of my talk is really to highlight what were the big technological changes that warrant the name of new generation. This is really a leap, it's not just a minor modification of what has happened. Now, also from my, from this brief overview of what happened over time, you got the sense that when a technology is deployed on a market and customers can buy devices, the technical community, academic and not, starts to think about the next generation. And so you may wonder whether now we are already thinking about 6G. And the answer is yes. The community is working right now on 6G, something that will be, if things kind of stay as we have seen so far, deployed in about 2030. So we'll get there. So as I said, I want to talk about the technology that made these big steps between one generation to the next of wireless systems. And I hope that in about half an hour from now, things that you are seeing in this slide would make sense. So when we go from generation to generation, devices are becoming better. So we go from the brick phone to a small phone that was used for just making voice call and possibly send SMS, to things like the BlackBerry that would allow to do emails and other form of basic browsing, to the very powerful smartphones that we're using today. And going forward, we are thinking that wireless is just not going to be for, say, human initiated type of communication, but it's really for anything that has the possibility or an advantage of being connected and communicate, will be connected and will be able to communicate. So we are thinking of 5G as a technology that will allow things like driverless car, autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, the so-called Internet of Things, where we're going to have a lot of sensors that are going to be, say, spread all over a city to monitor, traffic, pollution, water level, and so on. So all these are kind of machine to machine, vehicle to vehicle communications. So these have very different type of requirements from things that are related to, say, voice or browsing. So this is where the big step going from 4G to 5G, but the big technology step that we had to do going from 4G to 5G. So, so devices is one thing, but what is at the core of this technology of these different generations? So I want, at the end of your talk, at the end of my talk, I would like you to be understanding what it means that we went from analog voice to digital voice when we went from 1G to 2G. What it meant to have one voice network to have one data IP network when we went from 2G to 3G. I'd like you to understand some of the key aspects of the LTE advanced technology, especially things that you might have heard, become familiar with, OFDM and MIMO technology. And then I'm going to talk briefly about what 5G is and what 6G may be. Okay, so one major indicator of how this technology have improved over time is the kind of speed that they allow for communication. So I'm going to give you just an analogy to get you a sense of, what this technological improvement have been giving in terms of speed. So you can think of a 1G network as a person having a lazy walk. So that's the speed of a 1G network. The 2G network can be thought of a car speeding on a motorway. The speed of 3G networks is the equivalent of a fighter jet. With 4G, which what we have right now, is like a satellite, a probe that is orbiting around the planet. And you can think of 5G, what will become of 5G is the equivalent of a starship zigzagging around stars. So this is how this technology improvements that I'm going to talk about materialized from the point of view of a user in a much faster speed of communication, and thus, enabling a much larger array of applications going from one generation to the next. Okay, so first things first, let's understand why mobile cellular networks are actually called cellular. So this is a picture I got from Wikipedia. This is Martin Cooper, who was a lead engineer in Motorola in the 70s. This picture is from 2017, and he's holding in his hand the mobile phone that the team he was leading developed. So this is called a brick phone. And I think I don't need to explain why it has this name. So the weight and the size of this have nothing to do with what we are now accustomed to when we talk about mobile devices. But the maybe fact that people are not aware of is that that brick phone would only last would have a battery life of only about 20 minutes. So Martin Cooper and his team filed a patent in 1973 in which they laid out the cellular concept. The patent was eventually granted 2 years later. So the way you need to think about it is that there is a phone network, say the dial-up network that we used to have in our households. And now you have devices that don't have a cable, so those mobile phones, and they need to be able to interconnect with a phone on the classical phone network. So what we need to develop is an interface that will allow the mobile phone to connect to what we now call the core network. And so the cellular concept is exactly what was put forth by Motorola at the beginning of the 70s to create that ability of a phone without any wire to connect to the core network. So the principle is kind of simple. And it's something that you have experienced, right? So when you are close to a speaker in a room, you understand well what the person is saying. But as you move away, so this axis in this picture represents distance away from the source, from the speaker. As you move away from the speaker, you perceive the level of the voice of the speaker lower and lower. At a certain point, when you are far enough, you may hear something that the person is speaking, but you are not able to understand what the person is saying. And if you are far enough, you won't be even realize that somebody is speaking. Now, the same thing goes on with electromagnetic waves. So here you have an antenna, say at position 0, that is going to emit a signal at a certain power. And then you measure the level of the power as you move away from that antenna. And the phenomenon you measured is exactly the same as the one I described for voice. So at a certain point, you won't be able to hear the signal that has been transmitted from that antenna. So what it means is that at that point, you won't be able to communicate any further. And so this is what the cellular concept is really, right? This realization that you may put an antenna in a given position in space, and that antenna is only able to cover a certain part of the territory up to a certain distance, after which devices will not be able to hear what that antenna says. Then you need to put another antenna that is able to cover another part of the geographical area. So all these antennas, we call them base stations. So in telecommunication, there is a lot of BS talk. So BS for base stations. So each base station covers a certain portion of a geographical area, and you put in them close enough so that there are no gaps in coverage. Each mobile terminal is going to connect to a base station. And a mobile terminal, kind of, like, you can think of the mobile terminal is communicating only with the closest base stations. What it means is that everything has to go through a base station. So if you are user A who wants to talk with user B in a different cell, you talk to your base station. The base station is going to do something with the core network, is going to reach the base station to which user B is connected to, and then the signal will be sent from the base station to the mobile terminal of this user. Even if two users are in the same cell, they will not communicate directly. Communication always goes through the base station. Now, base stations are allocated a certain portion, a certain frequency, a certain portion of the spectrum to communicate. Spectrum is very expensive. For those who remember the auctions that were the different states and nations had for selling 3G bands, you may remember how much money was spent on spectrum. So spectrum is scarce and is very expensive. So you want to use it to, the most efficient way possible. So, so this brings us to the concept of frequency reuse, right? So let's say that you are a base station in this cell here, which is colored in purple. You are assigned a certain portion of the spectrum, and all the users in your coverage will communicate with you by using that frequency. Now, you don't want the cells around you to use the same frequency because you are going to interfere with one another. Even though you may not really understand exactly what was said, what is said, you still hear the interference from that communication. So the cells around you will use different frequencies, and here different frequencies are represented by different colors. Two cells that are sufficiently far, physical distance, far from one another, they may use the same frequency because they are so far that they don't even realize that somebody else is using that frequency. So the frequency reuse is important because you want to be able to reuse the same frequency as much as possible, because this means that you need to spend less money to be able to cover a certain geographical area with your service. Now, as I said, the spectrum is jam-packed, is expensive, and is not for just anybody to grab. It's managed by national entities, like in the US here is the FCC, and if you want to use it for some commercial service, you need to pay for that. Now, there is a lot of spectrum, but there are a lot of services that use this spectrum, from say Wi-Fi, GPS, radar systems for defense, or say airspace, like landing radars at airports, but also like radio astronomy and other scientific applications. So the spectrum has to be regulated and managed. And although there are a lot of frequencies out there, not all are equally good. So low frequency, think about like FM radio, if you remember what an FM radio is. Those are low frequencies, and they travel pretty far in terms of distance, and they actually penetrate through buildings, like through walls. So that allows you to kind of have also things like indoor coverage, which is something that you want to. However, low frequency means high wavelength. Wavelength is something that has to do with the size of the antenna. And so, you don't want a dish, a parabolic dish of a size of, 1 meter or 2 to be attached to your phone, because it would just not be practical. So here it's a need to move to higher frequencies. But now higher frequency are suffer of, like more severe attenuation, and they are blocked by certain, materials that you might have in buildings and stuff around you. So there is like a sweet spot, which is what we now call the microwave band, where all our kind of services like Wi-Fi and cellular and so on are offered, that is around, a few gigahertz. And because that sweet spot, it's limited and everybody wants to be there, that's why it becomes expensive, and it's very important to regulate and make use of that the most efficient way possible. So advances in, across the different generation of wireless communications have been motivated by that better and better, more efficient use of the spectrum. So one of the first innovation that helped in managing better the spectrum was going from analog to digital technology. So what is an analog signal? So think about me talking right now, my voice, the level of my voice. That's an analog signal because it changes continuously from one point to the other in time. So imagine that this axis represents, like the intensity of my voice. I can start talking at a certain level and then I low down my voice, but then I increase it again and so on and so forth over time. So if I want to have a voice communication with somebody else, I need to convey the variation of my voice to that receiving point. So in an analog communication system, you would send this whole wave from one point to the next, okay? Now, the question is, do you need to do so in order to, say, in terms of voice, to have the other person on the other side understand what you are saying? And this was a work that was done, at the, again, in the 1900 by a bunch of scientists. But here I'm citing the work of two people, Nyquist and Shannon. We already mentioned Shannon. They worked and showed that in an analog signal, any analog signal with quotes, can be reconstructed at the receiving end to any degree of accuracy by using its digital version. So what do I mean by digital version? So this is what Nyquist said. If you look at, again, at the time axis, you don't need to know the signal at every single point in time, but it's enough that you sample, so you take a picture of, so to speak, of the signal at just equally spaced points in times. Those are called sampled. And Nyquist said that given the characteristics of the signal, there is, you need to take those samples at a given separation. And if you follow his theory, you will be able to reconstruct the signal from the samples. What Shannon proved is that you can, so you can think of sampling or Nyquist as something that happens on the time axis. Shannon theory, it's something that looks about the level of the signals. And so what Shannon developed a theory that allows us to essentially say that you do not need to send all possible values, but you can actually think of the variations of the signal, the amplitudes, as being, sliced into, in this particular example, in equally spaced intervals. And then if a sample falls to within an interval, you just approximate the signal to the closest level in this quantization. And then you pretend that the signal is constant over that interval. So what we're doing here is we are approximating a continuous signal like the red one by a staircase in which both the steps on the time axis, so the horizontal axis, and the steps on the vertical axis are discrete, okay? And so why is this good? Well, it's because instead of saying in this interval, instead of sending these all many different values, you just have to send one value. In the next time interval, you need to send another value. And this set of values are taken from a finite set. In particular, in this example, we have 16 levels, and 16 levels can be represented by 4 bits. So to make it easier, if you have bits which are just zeros and ones, if you have just a 0 and a 1, you can distinguish between 2 things. But if you have 2 bits, you can make strings of length 2, and now you can distinguish between 4 things that you can label as 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. Now, if you have 3 bits, you can label 8 different things. If you have 4 bits, you can label 16 different things. So in a communication system, what we need to do is, for this period of time, we need to send the binary representation of this level. In this period of time, we need to send the binary representation of this level. So what this says is that at the end of the day, everything is just a sequence of zeros and ones. Now, you can play with both, the granularity of the time axis for the sampling and the granularity of the quantization on the vertical axis to get a better and better quality. And so, for example, for GSM, which was the first digital standard for voice, the voice was sampled 8,000 times a second, and it was represented over 8,192 levels, which is the equivalent of 13 bits. But voice for a phone call is just like me talking. Now imagine that instead you want to have something that, I don't know, is able to reproduce the range of the voice of, say, Pavarotti. That requires a lot more accuracy. And so, for example, on CD audio, the voice is sampled 44,000 times a second, and each sample is represented over 16 bits, which is 65 something thousand levels. So you can play with these quantizations and sampling to get essentially any accuracy you want. The more accurate, the more bits you need to send, and the faster you need to send them. So from a point of view of a network, everything is just a sequence of zeros and ones. How do you send those zeros and ones? You need to imprint them on an electromagnetic wave. And you can do so by changing either the frequency of an electromagnetic wave, or the amplitude, or the phase, or just any combination of those, right? So for example, for frequency, you can assign to a 0 a low frequency signal, and to a 1 a high frequency signal, or a low amplitude versus a high amplitude, or any combination of those. So being able to change more things at once in combinations allows you to send more bits every time you do a change in your electromagnetic wave. So for example, in 2G system, we used 2 different frequencies to send bits. This is called 2 frequency shift keying modulation scheme. In 3G, we used 4 different values of the phase. So we changed the phase of the signal, and we ended up with what is normally referred to as a 4 frequency shift keying modulation scheme. With 4G and 5G, technology has improved, and now we do combination of amplitude and phase. And for example, with 4G, which is what we are using now, we can have 64 different combinations of amplitude and phases, meaning that every time we do a change in the electromagnetic wave, we can send up to 6 bits. With 5G, we are gonna be able to change at the same time between 256 different combinations of amplitude and phase, meaning that every time we do a change, we will be able to communicate 8 bits of information. Now, there is no free lunch. Doing this, going higher with the modulation order, so say from 2 to 256, doesn't come for free. So it's true that we can send more bits, but now we need to be very careful about how we do things because noise becomes a problem. So what do I mean with that? And I see that I'm already running out of time, so I'll try to speed up. So digital technology is important because it allows us to clean up a signal. So again, think about sending 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. for whatever reasons that I'm not going to be able to talk about now, the signal is distorted at the receiver. So you don't see the clean steps. You see, you know, this wiggly function. Now, if this is an analog signal, and remember that the signal also attenuates in power as it propagates. So what you would do with an analog signal, you just amplify the signal. But at the same time, you also amplify the noise, which is not good. On a digital signal, because you know that things can only be either low or high, you can actually clean up the signal before you send it forward. And now, even if there is noise, you are able to see that this was a low, a high, a low, a high, and a low, which means that you had sent a 0, a 1, a 0, a 1, and a 0. So now you can clean up the effect of the noise and send the signal further. Now, you can do a lot of things. You can also protect from errors, and there are a bunch of techniques that are called error correction that, again, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip, but I will be more than happy to answer questions if you have them later. So innovation number 3, packet networks. Okay, so we are thinking about these networks in which a lot of things are connected, and there are a lot of applications from voice to data to streaming to sensors and so on. So how can we even think about, you know, making sense of such a complex system? So the way we think about systems is we kind of try to separate logical functions, and then we have different groups of people that are just focusing on some of those functions, and they're trying to make them, you know, the best possible. And these different functions or these different blocks in a system, at some point we'll have to communicate. And so we just create interfaces between these two in such a way that, you know, you can change one block, but you don't need to change all the rest. So in a say a 2 up to 3G network, we would have, you know, mobile phones that need to connect to a radio interface to be able to communicate with the core networks. Now, if you were making a voice call, your radio interface would route would establish for your communication what is called a circuit, a route, and that would connect to the public phone network. However, if you wanted to send, say, an email, it would be routed to what is called a packet network, and then there to the internet. Now, with the realization that everything is bits, so we don't really need to separate between voice and other data service, in 4G, we are now treating everything as a packet of bits of data, and they're all going through the same, you know, radio access network and the same packet network back to something that is essentially just the internet these days. What is a packet and why it's useful? So imagine you are trying to, say, communicate a movie, a video. It's just too big. So packet is conceptually just a unit of information that can be moved from a source to a destination. So think about, you know, I want to send an email, and this email is very long. So this email, what happens in a network, it gets chopped into, say, in this example, 2 pieces. The first piece of the email, I'm going to call it a payload. This payload is like a letter that you're writing. If you want to send that letter must be put in an envelope that contains the address of the person who's sending the letter, the address of the person who's receiving the letter, and if your letter is very long and you're using multiple envelopes, a sequence number for those envelopes. This information is called a header. The combination of the useful information with the address is what we call a packet. Everything in a network is just a packet. It's just an envelope that has to be moved around. Now, what is the switched network, the one that was used for voice? So imagine that I have to go from Chicago to visit a dear friend of mine in Minneapolis, and we are a group of friends, and we cannot just fit all in one car, but we need to use 2 cars. So this would be the 2 packets that need to be routed from Chicago to Minneapolis. So in a switched network, the 2 cars would have to follow exactly the same road. In this case, this particular motorway that is highlighted on the Google map. Also, that road would be blocked to any other traffic. So it's a dedicated circuit from a transmitter to a receiver. This, as you can imagine, if you think about the analogy with traffic, it's not efficient, right? Because it's not the best way of that route, which is frequency, which is spectrum, which is expensive. So in a packet network, the group of friends that want to go from Chicago to Minneapolis, they can follow different routes, and it doesn't matter, right? As long as they get to the destination. And routes can be shared between very many different applications. So this is the concept of packet network. The routes are shared between all kinds of applications, and even packets that are logically related to the same application, they can travel different routes. The important thing is that they get to the destination. So in networks, there are many layers. This is the abstraction that is used. It's called open system interconnection. The thing about routing that we talked happened in this middle box here, which is something, if you're familiar with terminology, is where the TPC protocol and the IP protocols are implemented. The things that I do in my research, and where in my opinion, the really big improvements between generations have happened, is in this lower part. It's called the physical and the data link, the lower layers in the networks. And this is what really has been the major change across different networks. And this is what I'm trying to now explain in the last few minutes of my presentations. Okay, so in a network, you have two problems that you need to solve once you have been able to connect your mobiles to the base stations. And one is you need to allow communication in two directions. So if you're having a conversation, you don't want to have a monologue, you want to hear what the other person is saying. So this is the problem of duplexing. So allow what is called uplink and downlink communications. So think of uplink, you uploading, say, your photos on the cloud, and downloading is the direction in which you say download the movie on your device. Okay, so you want these two-way communications. But also you want to allow multiple users to communicate at the same time, right? Imagine if in a city like Chicago, where you have maybe a couple of base stations, no, you have more, only one person at each point in time per base station could talk. The system would not scale, would not be doable. So you need to allow multiple users to be active, to communicate at the same time. And so this is the problem of multiplexing or multiple access. Now let's look at multiplexing. So you need a way to distinguish, to differentiate users in such a way that they don't, say, create problems to one another. So in a 1G network, the analog voice network, users were separated in frequency. Right? So you can think of a plane in which there is frequency, there is time, and in this direction, there is something else that I'm going to talk later. You can think that in time, a user uses the same, using all the time the same frequency, and different users, which are different colors here, use a different frequency. So this is frequency, division, multiple access. Now, this is maybe easy to do, but remember, spectrum is very expensive, and you might want to do a more efficient use of your spectrum. So in 2G, which is digital voice, users were separated in the time domains. So time was slotted, and say if two people wanted to talk at the same time, one people would talk for, say, 1 unit of time, and then the second person would talk, and then the first person would talk, and so on. Now, as a person who talks, you don't realize this, but this is how the network works. It just gives, allow one user to communicate at each point in time, and then it goes around the users that are allowed to communicate at the same time. So this is the frequency domain is used all the time, but at each point in time, you have different users. This is time, division, multiple access. Now in 3G, UMTS technology, a very different multiplexing idea was used. And this goes under the name of code division multiple access. This is something that was not new as an idea, was used by the military before. It has many properties desirable, including resistance to jamming and so on and so forth. Now in code division, each user is using all the time, both the frequency, all the frequency and all the time resources. The way in users are separated is in what we refer here as code domain. You can think of code domain as people speaking different languages. So you could have people speaking all the time as long as they speak different languages. A different language is a code. So you could have a person speaking English and a person speaking Italian. They can speak at the same time because the language allows them to distinguish. But two people speaking Italian, they cannot speak at the same time. That's code division. Now, right now in 4G, we are using something very different. It's kind of, as a relationship that I will explain with frequency division, but it's called orthogonal frequency division, multiple access. So let's look at how this works. In a frequency division system, the frequency access is given to different users. So say this could be Alice, this is Bob, and this is Charlie, and this is Daniela, and so on. Each user has a different frequency. That's why it's called frequency division. And in addition, you need to leave certain gaps between the channels allocated to the two users, because there are a lot of things that can go wrong. So you need a certain, they're called guard bands. Now, this is, remember, spectrum is expensive. So this seems to be not the most efficient use of spectrum. So in OFDM, engineers came up with a way of kind of squishing these frequency bands together. And not only they managed to get rid of the bands, the guard bands between the different channels, but they even came up with a technique by which the channel can actually overlap. So this would be the channel for Alice, this for Bob, this for Charlie, this for Daniela. They are actually overlapping with one another in a very controlled way, in such a way that those signals can still be separated, right? So this represents a very much more efficient use of spectrum, because now you can pack more users in less spectrum, or given the same amount of spectrum, you can have a lot more users. Also, it allows you to dynamically allocate resources among services and users. So you can think that both the frequency domain and the time domain are kind of slotted. And now you have such kind of physical resource that is a time frequency slot, and you can allocate them freely to the users. So the green user in this example would have these time frequency slots, these time frequency slots, and so on. The blue user would have instead this and this and this and this. So there is a problem of scheduling, which is not trivial, but allows you greater flexibility, because it allows you to enable different bit rates, different quality of services, which is something that you want in broadband system. Another major advance in 4G systems is the fact that we have introduced what is called multiple antennas. Now, remember I said spectrum is expensive, but spectrum is also something that you can, if you have more spectrum, you can communicate more information, right? So this is what Shannon told us, is that, if you look at the capacity of the channel, which is how many bits you can communicate per second when you use the channel, as a function of the bandwidth of the channel, that goes up. Unfortunately, it saturates at some point. So at the beginning, you can improve communications by improving bandwidth. But at some point, that improvement is negligible. And we are kind of working now in this regime where, well, the spectrum is used, the spectrum is expensive, but also increasing the spectrum would give you not such a big improvement, right? So here it's a latest addition to the many innovations of wireless communications. The idea that actually you need not operate with devices with one antenna. You can have multiple antennas. And the idea is that the more, the merrier. So for example, in 4G, now we have systems that are called 2x2. What it means is that there are two antennas at the base stations and two antennas at the there can be up to two antennas at the mobile receiver. So having two antennas at each side creates 4 possible paths, because now each antenna can communicate to each of the other antennas. Now this creates a diversity in space that if you do some, like quite sophisticated processing on those signals will allow you to create two different separate paths. So you can double the capacity for the same bandwidth and the same power by doubling the hardware, the number of antennas. So, so far 4G has provisions to go up to 4x4. So you can create 4 channels. You can multiply by 4 the number, you know, the throughput of the network. But in 5G, we are talking about massive MIMO, meaning going to something like 256 antennas per device in order to get that improvement in bitrate. So I know I've used a lot of my time, so I'm at the end of it. So this is what happens from a technological perspective. We had analog voice with frequency division multiplexing that got morphed into, you know, in a 2G system with digital voice, TDMA, time division multiple access, and what is called convolutional code for error corrections. 3G was using code division multiple access and a much powerful error correction techniques for correcting errors. 4G, we are using orthogonal frequency division multiple access with multiple antenna techniques and a new class of codes that are very powerful called turbo codes. 5G, while 5G is being deployed, there's been a lot of hype. We'll see what that will deliver. Is going to be an enhanced version of the technology that is used for 4G together with something that is called a new radio. It will be using the OFDM technology, but in addition, there will be a much higher bandwidth. So by now we are operating at microwave frequencies. We are going to go up all the way to millimeter wave, so gigahertz bandwidth. We are going to use MIMO, but in a massive way, so massive MIMO, and we're also going to use much more powerful classes of codes that are called polar and LDPC codes, and the array of applications will be much larger. So it's not just kind of broadband, you know, communications, say streaming videos or voice. We are also going to look at what are called machine type communications, say things that for autonomous vehicles, but also ultra reliable, low latency communications for all sorts of industrial applications and also things like wireless, autonomous vehicles. Now, while this is being deployed, we are thinking about what 6G is going to be. And so it's exciting to be thinking about what will happen in 10 years from now. 6G does not exist. But we know that it will, the vision is that it will be the internet of everything. So everything, really, sensors, devices, computers, cars, whatever you can think about, it will be connected. And it will need that network to allow that communication. And that will create value for humanity. So things that we are thinking about is thinking like global coverage. We will have, a combination of satellite networks with classical terrestrial network, maybe marine networks, and so on, so that every corner of the world will be covered with the same capabilities. Spectrum. In addition to the classical microwave type of bands, we are going to go at much higher frequency where there is a lot of spectrum available, but comes with a lot of issues, including it's much more difficult to go far and, penetration and so on. So we're going to go to millimeter wave, maybe even terahertz and optical wavelengths. There will be a new full range of application that will enable this vision of, this artificial intelligence driven society that we have in mind. And also because of all the kind of applications that, and the machines that will be not supervised by human, that will have to use the network, we really need to think about security and make sure that now the network is secure by design, not just because of some encryption protocol used at the application level. So 6G will be everything on steroids, will be extreme rate, extreme coverage, very high energy efficiency, extreme low latency, high reliability, massive connectivity. So this is the world we want. We are working as academics and industry to build for you in 10 years from now. So I'm sorry if I used a lot of time. It was about 3/4 of an hour instead of 30 minutes. I'm sorry for that, but I'm happy to take any questions if there are any about this very brief history of cellular wireless communications.
Thank you, Daniela. This was really a wonderful journey in the wireless communication. I think that you covered a lot, and we know more about our phone and mobile device work and what the future will bring us. You know, we are very excited about what the 6G at this point can do. So there are some questions. So the first one is, I wonder what are some of the geopolitical and ethical implications of the future you just envisioned?
So I'm not a geopolitical expert. I'm just gonna say one thing. The more you rely on technology, on things like, say, you might have a sensor on your pacemaker that decides when you need a little shock in your heart because your rhythm is irregular. Now, if that can be hacked, it's a problem. If your email account is hacked, it's a problem, but not serious. When you start having devices that, say, for example, have to do with your health, then hacking those devices is a much more serious problem. So this is where all this geopolitical stuff are coming into the picture. It's not my area. It's just a question of, you are now having very critical applications that can be hacked. How do you make sure that that doesn't happen? And that's why future networks will have this element of security by design built in, right? So that we will not have this geopolitical conversation anymore, because the network will be safe, because it has been designed to be safe. So that is all I can say about this issue.
Wonderful. So you talk about cellular networks, but you mentioned also that there are other networks like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So how they differ from the cellular one? Are they using the same antennas, or?
So they share the very same principle. So they are packet networks. They have an air interface. They communicate with the back network. They have mechanisms to allow multiple users to access the network. They have mechanisms to avoid interference. They have mechanisms to correct errors. So the principles are the same, but they are targeting different applications. So Wi-Fi is more for, like indoor, small spaces, right? So in principle, if you have a Wi-Fi router, you want to cover your apartment, say, but you don't expect that your Wi-Fi router will be able to talk to another Wi-Fi router. For that, you expect to be another type of network, the internet, that would do that for you. For Bluetooth is really for very kind of close in terms of distance communications, and that's it, right? So it's going to be it is very useful for short range communications, but you cannot expect to use a Bluetooth for example, to make a phone call to somebody that is, maybe just, few offices away in the same building. So they are same design principle, but because of the application that they are targeting, they have different solutions, right? So this means different access mechanisms, different error correction mechanism, different congestion mechanisms, but the basic ideas, packet networks, routing, error correction, multiple access, all these are shared by all these networks.
So another question is, are application of 5G to the health space on the horizon? For example, is the frequency band suitable to track human motion or image the human body better than existing RF devices?
So the answer is, and I know it might not be very satisfactory, but more or less everything is possible unless there is a physical law that says that is impossible, right? So we cannot communicate at a speed faster than the speed of light, that we know. But everything below that is in principle possible. And what is missing right now is the technology to do that. Technology has improved tremendously. So one of the things that has been, enabling a lot of this is that, I was using my iPad to stream my presentation, and I had my cell phone. Those are absolutely powerful computers that have been able to, being miniaturized, and they are doing so many computations. Those allow this more advanced type of applications. So again, maybe it's not satisfactory, but unless there is a physical law that says that is impossible, it can be done. The question is, do we have the technology to do that, right? So, you know, you might want to do, you know, some very fancy stuff, but if you need, you know, your device attached to a nuclear power plant because it requires too much power, it's not possible. So then you need to start working on batteries, right? So these kind of things, it's not usually just one single problem. It's an array of things that need to come together to be able to produce devices. And price. For the commercial aspect, price is also an element. So it can be done. It's just we don't have the technology at the moment, and people are actually working for producing such a technology.
So another question, could you please explain why more antennas help to increase the bandwidth if there is still one medium?
Okay, so this is about multi-antenna technology, right? So I guess an intuitive way to think about it is as follows. Maybe for the people that are a bit less young in the audience, you may have experienced or remember that, you know, you may have your phone and try to make a phone call and the quality was not very good. But you will maybe move just one step away, you know, physically just one step away, and the quality of the communication would improve. This is because there are a lot of things that are happening in a wireless media, and what you are trying to leverage with multi-antenna is the fact that maybe the signal is not good in one point in space, but not too far away from that, the signal is good or better, right? Or think about, you know, you are investing in the stock market, you want to have a diversified portfolio because, you know, maybe some stocks are bad, but not everything is bad at once, right? So you can look at other stocks and they're doing better. So the idea of multiple antennas is that in a device, now I'm exaggerating, right? But in this device, I could have multiple antennas that are sufficiently separated such that if at one point the signal is not very good, nearby may be better. And so this creates what is called space diversity. Now, there is a trade-off. If you put things too close together, they will just measure the same signal, so it's not good. So you need to have a certain separation, right? Which we know is in the order of the wavelength. So on a device, you can pack 2-4 antennas at the moment. And so the idea is that is this, right? So it's the same time as the phase frequency, but because of a lot of things that are going on in the wireless media, you know, you just move a little bit and the signal may be better. So you are actually leveraging that fact that, you know, if you have multiple things, not all of them will be bad. It's a bit more involved than that, but the essence is this idea that, you know, you can just move a little bit and maybe things are not that bad anymore.
Well, thank you, Daniela. I think that we ran out of time. We are already 10 minutes over time. Thank you again, Daniela, for being with us today. Thank you again I would like to thank all the board of the Chicago chapter that helped to organize this event today, and of course, the Italian Cultural Institute and the director. And thank you for all the people who joined us today, and happy holidays, and stay tuned for our next event. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Professor Tuninetti for the immense effort, I think, to squeeze all this information, not only to squeeze all this information in just 45 minutes, but also for the effort of making them accessible to those who, like me, have never approached these kind of topics. But it was very, very understandable and clear, and I would say enlightening. Even the last part about the 6G was how you put things very clearly about what's going to happen, or what the scientific world and the industry is thinking about our future. Yeah, it's let's say interesting and somehow scary and exciting, probably. So
thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here today. And if anybody has more questions, well, just Google the nicest lab at UIC and you'll find my information and you can ask all the questions you still have. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you.
And also one last thanks to AIRIcerca and Dr. Forte, because actually it's a pleasure to cooperate and join forces to disseminate and try to share scientific cultures with our audience. And we will, of course, keep on having more webinars like this in 2021. both online and probably, hopefully also physical in-person webinars. So thanks again, happy holidays to everyone, and we'll see each other around very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.